I'm going to talk about collaborating, and a new word that I picked up this morning was coordinating, not just collaborating, across the software supply chain. Just to introduce myself, I've been working in open source for about 25 years. I know it's amazing I started as a child, and it was back in the day, 98, I think, at Silicon Graphics that I started, working in open source. I lead the open source office for Amazon, and my team's task is to supply developers or support developers across the company in using open source in their development. I also chair the Linux Foundation board, supporting the mission of the Linux Foundation. So the reason I wanted to talk about coordinating and collaborating across the supply chain is because it's a very complicated supply chain. There's such a chorus of players, and as Ava was reminding me, every player plays multiple roles in the supply chain, so it's hard to know what our responsibilities are in securing software along this supply chain. And when you look at the word supply chain, it's actually used generally for formal relationships between, say, a supplier and a user through an agreement or through an end-user license agreement. But when you look at open source, there is no formal relationship often in the supply chain. And producers can be very small, independent producers, or they can be large companies releasing open source software, and consumers can be just consuming it accidentally through transitive dependencies, or they could be actively consuming open source software and have different responsibilities. So I wanted to talk about the different players in the supply chain and just describe these different players and hopefully come to some conclusion on what our responsibilities are along this supply chain. Because producers never intended for the software to be really used by, say, a government infrastructure or a mission-critical service at Google or Amazon or Microsoft, they never really produced it to be hardened or mission-critical or with security in mind, et cetera. And the consumer, downloads and consumes and really never gave thought to the fact that maybe this wasn't built for scale, wasn't built for security, wasn't built for the kind of use case that they have. So this creates this huge gap in expectations and delivery between the producer and the supplier of open source. So the question becomes, who's responsible for securing the component? Is it the consumer? Is it the producer? Is it someone in between? And I was just having a talk with somebody about this because when you look at the CRA, which is the Cyber Resilience Act,
it has it often looks at the upstream producer of software as someone who's responsible for fixing the security, right? So it's important to understand where should we hold people accountable for fixing or securing the software.
The supply chain, quotes again, because it's an accidental one, I think is a chorus of players in open source. And unlike a commercial supply chain, you have a producer, the
the
one
one who actually creates the software. Then you have foundations. Sometimes foundations play the role of producing the software, sometimes coordinating,
and
then
play
you
different roles. Then
then
sometimes you have
sometimes you have
curators, like maybe a
a
Red Hat
Hat
distribution
distribution
provider
provider
or
or
Ubuntu
Ubuntu
or
or
somebody
somebody
else
else who
who
curates different components
and
and
produces
produces
a
a
product or a
product or a
distribution.
distribution.
Then you
Then
have a
you have a
consumer
consumer
audit.
audit.
Then you have
Then
the
you have the
public
public
sector,
sector
who's
who's
increasingly
increasingly
both a
both a
consumer as
consumer as
well as
well
a
as a
policymaker.
policymaker.
And so
And
you
so
have
you
to
have to
say,
say,
uh,
um,
how do we
how do
all
we
work
all work
together?
together? And
in
in
each
each
category, you have
category, you have
different types
different
of
types of
players, and
players. And
so
so
who
who
does
does
what,
what
and how do
and
we
how do
work
we work
together and
together and
coordinate
coordinate
security is
security is
important.
important.
Frankly, this
Frankly,
is the
this is the
same
same
supply
supply
chain we
chain we
deal
deal
with from
with
an
from
open
an open
source
source
license
license
compliance
compliance
perspective
perspective
also,
also.
and we
And we
also
also
tend to
tend to
duplicate
duplicate
work
work
across the
across the
supply
supply
chain, which
chain,
we
which we
don't need
don't
to.
need to.
It would be
It would be
nice if we
nice if we
could
could
kind of
kind of
coordinate the
coordinate
work
the work
across
across
and
and
set up the
set up the
right
right
markers, if
markers,
you
if
will,
you will,
along the
along
way.
the way.
So
So
let's
let's
deep dive
deep
into
dive into
producers
producers
themselves.
themselves.
The
The
challenge with
challenge
open
with open
source
source
again is
again is
there's thousands and
thousands and
thousands and
thousands and
thousands of
thousands of
independent
independent
projects and
projects and
projects.
projects.
And so
And
a
so a
lot of
lot of
different
different
producers, from
producers,
very,
from
very
very,
small
very small
producers to
producers to
very
very
well-funded
well-funded
companies that
companies
are
that are
using open
using open
source
source
increasingly
increasingly
today.
today.
So there's
So there's
different
different
capabilities,
capabilities,
different
different
knowledge
knowledge
bases,
bases,
different
different
ability to
ability
kind
to
of
kind
fix
of
the
fix the
security
security
bug or
bug
have
or have
knowledge of how
knowledge of how
to
to
create secure
create secure
software.
software.
And I'm not
And I'm
worried
not
about
worried
the
about the
well-funded
well-funded
projects. I
projects.
think
I
they
think
will
they will
start doing
start
the
doing
right
the
thing
right
and
thing
have the
and have
funds
the
to do
funds to
it.
do it.
But it's
But
that
it's that
long
long
tail
tail
of
of
small
small
independent
independent
projects that are
projects that are
under-resourced,
under-resourced,
underfunded,
underfunded,
probably
probably
under-educated
under-educated
on or
on
have
or have
time to
time
do
to do
security.
security.
And there's
And
no
there's
real
no real
scalable way
scalable
to
way to
reach that
reach that
long
long
tail.
tail.
And
And
often that
often that
long
long
tail
tail
comes in
comes
the
in the
form of
form of
transit
transit
dependencies, not
dependencies,
even
not even
conscious
conscious
selections made
selections
by
made by
consumers. So
consumers.
how do
So
you
how do you
reach
reach
all of
all
them?
of them?
And I'm
And I'm
hoping
hoping
that
that
initiatives like
initiatives like
OpenSSF
OpenSSF
and
and
there are
there
some
are some
independent
independent
companies like
companies like
TideLift and
TideLift and
GitHub
GitHub
sponsors,
sponsors,
etc.,
etc.,
are
are
able to
able to
bridge that
bridge that
gap and
gap.
reach the small, long tail, if you will, by either setting standards or reaching them from funding perspective or education perspective. So next, let's go to nonprofit foundations like OpenSSF and OSTIF and others. These are such an important institution in open source because they help create and host and fund large ecosystems and projects like the Linux kernel, like security work that OpenSSF is doing, like CNCF, et cetera. And many of the challenges we all face as consumers is not restricted to any one company. We all share common challenges, so it's good to have a neutral home where we can solve these challenges together. And these neutral homes, like OpenSSF, are very, very helpful for reaching that long tail, but also creating standards and best practices and tools and roadmaps and research and scorecards for the community at large, kind of getting us all together on the same page and coordinating what we need to do together, which is so badly needed in this chorus of players that are there in open source. And they also advocate more and more with policymakers on what the open source community needs, like what Omkar and the team did in the White House, and with CISA and NIST and RFIs and the CRA, et cetera. I think policymakers could use the support and resourcing and education from bodies like OpenSSF and certainly Eclipse and Apache and others to understand the players and what can be done and what cannot be done by the different components in the supply chain, and really to serve as a coordinating function for things that need to be implemented. We still need a lot of coordination across foundations, frankly, to create more standard practices. And I'm really glad that the Congress was kicked off this year to bring under a common umbrella a lot of nonprofits so that we can coordinate across nonprofits as well. Then you have commercial curators. And there are various companies that fall into this umbrella. I talked about the fact that maybe if you're a distribution builder, you are curating, various upstream components, building it into a distribution, and creating that convenience, if you will, for downstream users. And you provide SLAs and support and help behind that. And you also work with upstream producers of the components that make it into your distribution. And it's worked really well. As an enterprise, for example, when I was in a media and entertainment company like Comcast, I didn't have the bandwidth nor the knowledge to deal with all of the different upstream open source projects. So it was really nice to kind of hold Red Hat or hold Ubuntu or someone responsible for all of those upstream, components, and get the support that I needed from one single place. And maybe it's a good policy or a practice for security as well, right? I could hold my distribution vendor accountable for giving me security and SLAs around that, and they then work with the upstream components to do that. There are also organizations like Tidelift, which are trying to do that, where they're saying for a subscription fee, we will work with upstream projects and make sure that they are meeting scorecards, they are improving their security posture, et cetera, because a company may not be able to reach every single open source body there. And then there are consumers. Consumers can fall into a couple of categories. It could be I'm an enterprise, banking, or an entertainment company, and I have no interest in, or nor have I the knowledge or the bandwidth to really deal with all the components I consume. So I just want, a curator to kind of do that work for me. Or it could be a technology provider like a Red Hat or an IBM or an Amazon or a Microsoft, who can do a lot more than just consume open source. They can actually curate, they can fix bugs and upstream those bugs, they can contribute to OpenSSF, they can work with other industry players to do more. So I think someone like a technology provider can take on a lot more to lift, if you will, the bar for open source and open source security. And they can find a way to understand what the key dependencies are and how they want to make sure those components are secure. Some they may own directly themselves, own the relationships with. Some they may work through a foundation. Some they may say, I think I'd rather work through a curator like a distribution provider or a Tidelift or some organization like that. So it's important for them to kind of understand how they intend to secure the components that they include in their services or products. And the public sector, and I believe this is a picture of a building in Brussels, and I meant to kind of make it very Europe-centric. I had the White House before. I replaced it with a European picture. The public sector is playing increasingly lots and lots of roles, right? And it's interesting. In these 25 years, it's only been in the last 10 years that I've seen the government play such an important role in technology and in open source and scrutinize how open source is being done, how it's being secured, et cetera. And they are consumers of open source, so they can use that power, if you will, to mandate that suppliers to the federal government or to different governments are able to meet the high bar that they have for security. And then they are also concerned about citizenry and making sure citizens are safe, their health is protected, their privacy is protected, as the European Union does, and they do a very, very good job of caring for their citizenry. And so you see a lot of these acts are the Cyber Resilience Act, the AI Act, et cetera, are all meant to make sure that the citizens of that country, the industry of that country, the consumers are protected from a security perspective, from AI, et cetera. And to be honest, I'm glad there are people like Ava who moved over to the government, but we need more education, we need more feedback, and the government is seeking active feedback, which is good. Because as you can see, the complexity of a supply chain in open source is pretty complex, and each player can be either an independent underfunded player or could be a very well-funded company. So the government needs to understand where to hold players responsible and what they can expect from the supply chain. And you want to reduce the burden on the unfunded players in particular. And SPOMs are an important element, but we need to then understand how to keep it secure, how to, what kind of metadata can we use from SPOMs to make decisions, how do we react when we see a vulnerability. So harmonizing work also across the different geographies is so important. It's going to be a huge burden on players if each government has different mandates and different requirements and different expectations, and you're constantly trying to say, if I'm shipping to EU, what requirements do I need to make? If I'm working only in the US, what do I need to do? And a lot of us are global companies, so we really need harmonization across governments to make sure that the requirements are consistent. The food movement has a lot of inspiring lessons to learn, if you will. The food labeling. I understand that Alan Friedman has a Twinkie on his desk, and the food label on the Twinkie is what he was inspired by, and was kind of looking at how can we as consumers understand what we are consuming, where it's coming from, what does it mean to our bodies and health. And I think it's a great inspirational element to understand. Imagine just 20, 30 years ago, there were no food labels, and you would just blindly consume off the shelf and not know how it impacted your health. And now we are all so much better at consuming components. And the farm-to-table movement is another one that started in California, where the whole intent was, how can we bring more transparency into the whole supply chain and what we consume, making sure that production is more sustainable, that we have relationship and knowledge of where our food comes from, and have a relationship with the producer of the food, not just knowing that it's a slab of meat in a supermarket, but know the butcher and the farm that it grew on. And really a more healthy supply chain, if you will, for food, and more relevant to what our needs are. So with that, I wanted to kind of close with saying, I think Rebecca said this, Onkar said this, we need more coordination, we need more collaboration. We need to really have also a taxonomy, if you will, of the different players in the supply chain, what their capabilities are, what they can do, and who to hold accountable, and who does what along this supply chain, so that we are not duplicating work, and we're not putting undue burden on, say, an unfunded independent producer who may not be able to bear the cost of security. Thank you very much.